Mr. President, prior to Senator Reid offering his proposal, the pending business before the Senate was an amendment that I offered earlier this week, which was designed to promote better transparency, accountability, and oversight within our government. I'm deeply disappointed that a procedural tactic will be invoked to prevent an up or down vote on my amendment, which is designed to bring the proliferation of czars under the normal process. Mr. President, the amendment that I proposed would have ensured that the 18 new czar positions appointed by this administration could be held accountable to Congress and to the American people. The proliferation of czars under the current administration to manage some of the most complex and important issues facing our country has created serious problems in oversight, accountability, and transparency. It is of great concern to me, Mr. President, that these positions circumvent the congressional requirements for oversight. They circumvent the constitutional process by which the Senate is supposed to give advice and consent to major policy positions within our government. Mr. President, I have a list of 18 new czar positions that have been created by this administration that I would ask unanimous consent be made part of the record.
Without objection?
Many of the czars on this list seem to either duplicate or dilute the statutory authority and responsibilities that Congress has already conferred upon cabinet-level officials and other senior executive branch officials who go through the normal constitutional process whereby the Senate gives its consent to these nominees. As I said when I first introduced this amendment, I do not consider every position that's been identified as a czar in various media reports to be problematic. Some of those positions are established by law. Some of them are subject to Senate confirmation. Rather, my amendment is carefully tailored to cover so that it would not apply to positions recognized in law or subject to Senate confirmation. For example, the proposal that I have would not apply to the Director of National Intelligence, to the National Security Advisor, to the Homeland Security Advisor, to the Chairman of the Recovery, Accountability, and Transparency Board, to the so-called information or regulatory czar within OMB. These positions, because they are recognized in law or they are subject to Senate confirmation, simply do not raise the same kinds of concerns about accountability, transparency, oversight, and vetting. Instead, my amendment has been carefully tailored to cover officials that the President has unilaterally designated as responsible for significant policy matters. It would not have covered the President's Chief of Staff, for example, and it would not cover less senior White House officials, despite some misinformation to the contrary. Now, Mr. President, because the White House has raised so many objections to my amendment, I have offered to sit down with the White House counsel and narrow the scope of the amendment still further to address any concerns that the White House might have. Unfortunately, the White House failed to provide any modifications to the text of my amendment. Instead, they just said that they did not want any of these officials to be called to testify before Congress. And let me explain exactly what my amendment would have done, so you can see, Mr. President, how modest indeed the amendment was. It simply would have required that the President certify to Congress that officials in these important positions would respond to all reasonable requests to testify before or provide information to congressional committees with jurisdiction over the issues involved. Second, it simply would have required these officials to submit a biannual report to the congressional committees with jurisdiction describing the activities of the official and his or her office and any rule, regulation, or policy that the official participated or assisted in the development of policy. Mr. President, that's it. That's it. How can we possibly be against that kind of accountability, transparency, and oversight? It is our job as members of Congress to conduct such oversight. We can't do so when the administration sets up a structure where there is an energy czar, an urban affairs czar, an environmental czar, a cybersecurity czar. The list goes on and on and on. And it creates, Mr. President, confusion over who is in charge, who is making policy. Let's take the area of health care. Is the top policy position in this administration Nancy Ann DeParle, who is the health care czar within the executive office of the president, a person, by the way, for whom I have the greatest respect? Or is it Senate-confirmed Kathleen Sebelius, the Secretary of Health and Human Services? Who's in charge? Who do we hold accountable? What the president has done by creating so many czar positions within the White House that appear to duplicate the executive branch officials that are subject to Senate confirmation is to blur the lines of authority. And that is not good for our system of government. And it is not in keeping with this administration's pledge to be the most transparent administration ever, a pledge for which I salute the president.
For a question?
I would be happy to yield.
I'd like to ask the senator about her amendment, and the first thing I would like to ask is your amendment does not specify how many czars, I think that's the term you used on the floor, how many czars you think there are in the administration or what their titles are. Could you tell me how many czars we are going to try to impact with your amendment?
I would be happy to. Mr. President, I would say to my friend that I have a list of 18 positions which I've talked repeatedly about and which I have inserted into the record. And I have, as I've said, I am not one who has used this term in the way that some have to include individuals with broad authority across various agencies, like the Director of National Intelligence, but that is a position that is established or recognized in law and is subject to Senate confirmation. I did not include those, and in fact, in the language of my amendment, I specifically say it does not apply to positions established in law.
If the senator would yield and could share a copy of that list with me, I'd appreciate it. But in the meantime, I might ask the senator, it seems that the czar watchers on your side of the aisle Senator Hutchison, for example, she found 32 czars when she went looking. And one of the advisors to some politicians, and I won't include the senator from Maine, she can speak for herself, the noted guru Glenn Beck has identified 32 czars as well. So I'd just like to ask the senator from Maine, before we get into the propriety of her amendment under the Senate rules, who's going to define who is covered by your amendment? If your colleague from Texas found 32, Glenn Beck found 32, you found 18.
Mr. President, I'd be glad to respond to the question of my colleague. My colleague did not have the benefit of being on the floor when I first presented my amendment, and I addressed this very issue. I was very careful in drafting this amendment to make clear that I was not talking about positions that are recognized in law. Some of my colleagues legitimately have taken a different approach, but that is not the approach that is before the Senate now. Rather, I have taken into account issues that have been raised by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, such as Senator Byrd, who certainly knows more about the Constitution than I think any of us who are serving at the present time, who's expressed concerns about the proliferation of czars. I've taken into account concerns expressed by Senator Feingold, by Senator Feinstein, and I've done a careful, narrowly tailored amendment that does not attempt to sweep in positions that are recognized in law, nor does it sweep in positions that are subject to Senate confirmation. And that's why it's so disappointing to me that my colleagues are not unanimously adopting my amendment, which it looked like they were going to do earlier this week before the White House weighed in, because I did not take a broad sweeping approach. I took a very narrow, careful approach that aimed at the problems I've talked about, the lack of oversight, transparency, and accountability.
Senator would yield further for a question. I'd like to ask the senator, I've been told that using the definition of czar that Mr. Beck, the political advisor to some, Senator Hutchison, and even you use, that under President George W. Bush, the previous Republican administration, one could characterize his officials and advisors in the executive office of the presidency and other agencies as an Afghanistan czar, an AIDS czar, a drug czar, a faith-based czar, an intelligence czar, a Mideast peace czar, a regulatory czar, a science czar, a Sudan czar, a TARP bailout czar, a terrorism czar, and a weapons czar under the previous administration. And I would like to ask the senator from Maine if she proposed this amendment under a Republican president who clearly had his own stable of Muscovite czars of a lot of different versions.
Mr. President, I again would be happy to attempt to clarify this issue for my colleague and friend, and he is my friend from Illinois, and I realize that he has his role to play in this debate. But the fact is, he's just listed several positions that are established by law. The intelligence czar is the director of national intelligence, Dennis Blair. Joe Lieberman and I wrote the law that established that position in 2004, and he is confirmed by the Senate. The regulatory czar, he's referring to Cass Sunstein in this administration and John Graham in the previous one. It is established by law. It is part of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs within OMB. I'm not talking about those positions, and no matter whose administration it is. And I am talking about perhaps other positions on his list, regardless of whose administration they're in. I would apply the same standards. Now, the senator would then say, well, why didn't I offer this amendment in the previous administration? The answer is we didn't have this proliferation of czar positions in the previous administration. But, Mr. President, I would say to my colleagues, regardless of whether it's a Democratic president or a Republican president, a Democratic Congress or a Republican Congress, I think this is an institutional issue. And I think all of us as members of Congress should be very concerned about organizational structures that make it impossible for us to conduct effective congressional oversight, that insulate these officials who have significant policy responsibilities from ever coming to testify, from going through the vetting and the confirmation process. I think that's a problem, regardless of who the president is, and I'm not the only one who thinks it. That's why Senator Robert C. Byrd wrote to the White House, wrote to the president to, as this press release says, questions the Obama administration on the role of White House czar positions, because, as he says, too often I've seen these lines of authority and responsibility become tangled and blurred, sometimes purposely to shield information and to obscure decision-making. I'm not saying this is part of a plot to obscure information, but what I'm saying is we have an obligation to exercise our constitutional duties, and the proliferation of these unaccountable positions in any administration makes that impossible for us to do so. So, Mr. President, if I could complete just the end of my statement before we got into this good little colloquy, and I do appreciate the opportunity to clarify who my amendment would cover, whom would be covered by it, and who would not. As I said, I was willing to work with the White House to make this even clearer if need be. My staff was here many hours last night. I had conversations with White House officials, and unfortunately, at the last moment, they decided not to try to propose revisions to the text. Now, I am not going to seek to overturn the chair's ruling on this amendment, which will be forthcoming, and I know how it will go. But I do think it's unfortunate that a procedural tactic is being used to block a vote on this amendment. And I do want to tell my colleagues that I think this is a real issue, and I'm very pleased that the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee under Chairman Lieberman is going to hold a hearing to explore this issue, because it does have constitutional ramifications, and it does involve the balance of power between the executive and the legislative branch. But the ruling the chair is going to make is not going to be the last word on this subject. The administration any administration needs to fully explain the responsibilities and authorities of these czars, and until all of these czars are made available to testify before and provide information to Congress, until Congress is fully consulted on the decisions to create these positions in the first place, I will continue to press forward on this issue. I believe that the amendment that I drafted was a very reasonable, balanced one, and it would have been a significant step toward establishing an oversight structure for these positions that would provide the transparency, accountability, and oversight our nation expects from its leaders. And I am dismayed that the Senate is about to choose a point of order over these principles. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.